Francisco Franco Bahamonde was born in 1892 in the naval town of Faro. He came of age in a Spain consumed by the loss of empire and by the authoritarian impulse that followed. The dictatorship of General Miguel Primo de Rivera from 1923 to 1930 left deep cultural marks that would suit Franco. Primo de Rivera elevated the army as the moral core of the nation, married the state to Catholic corporatism, outlawed strikes, and framed regional aspirations in Catalonia and the Basque Country as threats to unity. Those habits of mind military tutelage, Catholic nationalism, centrally imposed order were the soil in which Franco's own politics would thrive when his time came. Franco's formative experience was North Africa. He volunteered for Morocco in 1912 and spent most of the next 14 years in the RIF, first as a young officer and then as a rising commander in the new Spanish Legion, which had been created in 1920 by José Milán Astre. The Legion and the Moroccan Regulars became Franco's school of war. Aggressive small unit warfare, relentless pursuit, exemplary terror. He was seriously wounded at El Biuts in 1916 and promoted for bravery. After the amphibious landing at Alhucemas Bay in 1925 helped break the RIF rebellion, he became, in 1926, Spain's youngest brigadier general at 33. The African army's reputation was built on ruthlessness. Contemporary accounts and modern historians describe beheadings, mutilations, and reprisal killings by legionaries and allied irregulars. Preston notes that Franco's Africanist circle accepted and cultivated a culture of terror designed to cow civilian populations. Spain also used chemical weapons in Morocco during the first half of the 1920s, notably mustard gas delivered from the air, a fact long denied in official memory, but documented in research on the RIF War. Franco did not direct the chemical campaign, but it was part of the toolbox of the African army that made his career, and it shaped his view that war was won by annihilating resistance rather than negotiating it. The RIF War, 1912 to 1926, Franco's school of violence, when Francisco Franco left the Toledo Infantry Academy. In 1910, he graduated without distinction, near the bottom of his class. His small stature and falsetto voice had earned him little respect among cadets, but he had a single advantage over most of his peers: an unshakable sense of discipline and ambition. Spain at the time offered little glory. The 1898 defeat by the United States had stripped the empire of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, leaving only small holdings in Africa. For a young officer who wanted rapid promotion, there was only one destination: Morocco. Spain and Morocco. Spain's presence in northern Morocco dated to the late 19th century. But it was in 1912, with the Treaty of Fez, that Spain formally received a protectorate over a stretch of territory along the Rif Mountains. This was no settled colony. The Berber tribes of the Rif, led by charismatic figures such as Abdi al-Krim, resisted fiercely. Spanish garrisons were besieged, patrols ambushed, and officers killed in humiliating defeats. To Madrid, Morocco was both a burden and a necessity, a place to satisfy military ambition, to project prestige, and to distract from internal turmoil. For Franco, it was the proving ground. In 1912, he arrived in Melilla, a fortified coastal city, and was posted to the harsh front lines. The young lieutenant found himself in a war that was nothing like the European campaigns of set battles and formal maneuvers. This was counterinsurgency, raids, ambushes, and reprisals. Villages suspected of sheltering rebels were burned. Civilians were forced to flee. Franco embraced it, got El Biuts and a legion in June 1916. At the Battle of El Biuts, Franco was shot in the abdomen. The wound nearly killed him. Surgeons did not expect him to live. He survived, and his recovery fed a lifelong belief in destiny. His voice, damaged by the wound, rose to a peculiar high pitch that would mark him forever. At just 23, he was promoted to captain for bravery. His real breakthrough came in 1920, when José Milán Estrella founded the Spanish Foreign Legion, Tercio de Extranjeros, modeled on the French. It was designed to be Spain's elite shock force in Morocco, disciplined, fanatical, and merciless. Franco became Milán Estrella's deputy, and by 1923, he was commander of the Legion. His reputation soared. He drilled his men with absolute discipline, punished breaches harshly, and demanded obedience. Unlike many officers, he did not drink, gamble, or chase women. His aloofness added to the aura of severity. The Legion became infamous for its brutality. Legionaries carried out reprisals against civilians, summary executions, and ritualized violence. Decapitation of enemies and display of severed heads were reported by foreign observers. Paul Preston, Franco's modern biographer, describes the Army of Africa as cultivating a deliberate culture of terror. Franco did not invent this culture, but he thrived in it. Absorbing its lesson, fear is the most efficient weapon of control. The disaster of Annual 1921. Spain's humiliation came in July 1921 at the Battle of Annual. Abd el-Krim's Rif forces routed the Spanish army, killing some 10,000 soldiers and leaving northern Morocco in rebel hands. It was one of the greatest defeats in modern Spanish history. Franco and his legion were among the few forces that maintained cohesion in the chaos, retreating in order rather than disintegrating. His reputation as an officer who never lost his head grew. The disaster hardened attitudes in Madrid. Politicians demanded vengeance. The Army of Africa, Franco's legion, and the Moroccan regulars became the spearhead of a new offensive. And with them came escalated violence. Chemical warfare in the Rif between 1923 and 1926. Spain employed chemical weapons against the Rif. Archival research has shown that Spanish squadrons dropped mustard gas, phosgene, and chlorpacrin from aircraft on villages, fields, and markets. These were not tactical strikes against entrenched fighters, but deliberate terror against civilians to break support for Abd el-Krim. Victims described blisters, blindness, and burned lungs. Franco did not plan the gas campaign. It was directed by the High Command in Madrid, but he was part of the officer corps that executed the broader strategy of annihilation. The Army of Africa fought in areas that had been subjected to gas bombardment. For Franco, this was proof that any method was justified if it pacified resistance. The El Husmas, landing 1925. In September 1925, Spain and France launched the El Husmas landing, one of the first major amphibious operations in modern warfare. More than 13,000 troops landed with naval and aerial support, including tanks and aircraft. Franco led part of the assault. It was a success. Abd el-Krim's Rif Republic was broken, and by 1926, the war was over. Franco was promoted to brigadier general at just 33, the youngest in Europe. Lessons from Morocco. Franco's years in Morocco were decisive for his character and methods. He learned that fear works. Civilians who were terrorized did not rebel. Discipline is everything. His legion did not collapse at Annual, and he never forgot that. Brutality is legitimate. Reprisals, executions, and chemical bombardments were not aberrations but tools. The army is Spain's salvation. Politicians in Madrid were weak. Soldiers like him saved the nation. The Army of Africa became Franco's political base. Its officers were his peers and allies. Its ethos of discipline and violence would be transplanted into Spain itself during the Civil War. Franco left Morocco not as a minor officer, but as one of the most promising generals in Spain. A man who had risen faster than almost anyone in his generation. The colonial war, fought on the margins of empire, would become the template for a domestic war of extermination. The fall of Primo de Rivera in 1930 and the Second Republic's birth in 1931 briefly checked Franco's rise. He stayed disciplined and aloof, taught at the Zaragoza Military Academy, and cultivated ties within the officer corps. The Republic's reform attempts land redistribution, church and army reform, regional autonomy polarized politics. In October 1934, when a miners' uprising exploded in Asturias against a right-wing government, Franco was among the generals sent to crush it, and the Army of Africa's methods summary courts. MASS arrests, severe reprisals were imparted to the peninsula. The revolutionary left's violence during that insurrection and the state's response deepened the logic of civil war. Asturias, 1934. Repression comes home. By the early 1930s, Spain was lurching between experiment and backlash. The monarchy had fallen in 1931, replaced by the Second Republic, a fragile democratic regime that tried to drag Spain into the modern age. Land reform, secular schools, the curtailing of church privileges, and plans to reduce the bloated officer corps sent shockwaves through conservative Spain. Landowners, monarchists, industrialists, and the Catholic hierarchy saw an attack on the social order. Workers, peasants, anarchists, and socialists felt reform was too slow, too shallow. The officer corps, the same men hardened in Morocco, watched uneasily. Franco, still relatively young, but already a general, was cautious in politics. He disliked the Republic's reforms, but he cultivated an image of professionalism. His opportunity came in 1934, when repression inside Spain would look almost identical to colonial repression in Morocco. The political crisis in November 1933. The right-wing Catholic Party, CEDA, Confederación Española de Derechos Autónomos, won the most seats in Parliament. In October 1934, when CEDA ministers joined the government, the socialist left saw it as a betrayal. In Asturias, a region dominated by miners and socialist unions, a general strike escalated into open revolt. The miners were heavily organized, many armed with rifles, dynamite, and explosives. They declared a revolutionary commune, seized police barracks, and took control of major towns. For 2 weeks, Asturias became a laboratory of revolution. Elsewhere in Spain, strikes collapsed quickly. But in Asturias, the uprising was fierce. The miners executed priests, destroyed churches, and killed civil guards. Estimates suggest between 100 to 200 clergy and civilians associated with the right were killed during the uprising. The government panicked. Enter Franco. The conservative government called for the Army of Africa. Franco, by then trusted for his discipline and efficiency, was placed in charge of coordinating the suppression from Madrid. He did not command troops in the field directly, but supervised the deployment of the Foreign Legion and Moroccan regulars. These were the very units Franco had led in the RIF, hardened, ferocious, and accustomed to terror tactics. The suppression, the miners' revolt, was crushed with overwhelming force. Villages were shelled by artillery. Rebel-held towns were stormed by legionaries and Moroccan troops. Summary courts were convened on the spot. Prisoners were lined up against walls and shot. Mass arrests followed. Tens of thousands of miners and sympathizers were rounded up and imprisoned. Casualties remain debated, but estimates place the total dead at around 2,000. Of these, perhaps 1,500 were miners killed in combat. 300 to 400 were soldiers and security forces, and 200 to 300 were civilians executed or killed in reprisals. Around 30,000 miners were arrested. Torture of prisoners was widespread. The brutality shocked the Republic. The use of colonial troops on Spanish soil was unprecedented. The Moroccan regulars, Berber mercenaries, became symbols of government cruelty. For Franco and his fellow Africanists, the lesson was the same as in Morocco. Overwhelming violence crushed dissent. Franco's reputation. Asturias uprising changed Franco's trajectory. To the left, he was now a butcher, the general who imported colonial terror into Spain. To the right, he was the man who saved the Republic from revolution. He was promoted to Chief of the General Staff in 1935, making him one of the most powerful officers in Spain. He insisted that his methods had been surgical and necessary. Privately, he was satisfied. Order had been restored, and he had proven his indispensability. A dress rehearsal for Civil War Asturias was a rehearsal for what would come in 1936. The patterns were already visible. The Army of Africa as the regime's hammer. Troops accustomed to colonial brutality were the instrument of repression. Summary justice. No patience for trials. No distinction between rebel combatants and political sympathizers. Civilians as targets. Terrorizing populations was seen as legitimate strategy. Franco's aloof command. He did not need to pull the trigger himself. He directed others and assumed responsibility. Ace burned into the collective memory of Spain. To the right, it was proof that socialism meant chaos, atheism, and murder. To the left, it was proof that the state would unleash foreign mercenaries and firing squads to defend the old order. For Franco personally, it was vindication. His Moroccan lessons worked just as well at home. Transition to the civil war, the Republic staggered on, polarized more than ever. In February 1936, elections returned the Popular Front, a coalition of left-wing parties, to power. The right seethed. Officers whispered of coups. Franco, cautious as ever, bided his time. He was transferred to the Canary Islands in June 1936, partly to keep him away from the conspiracy. But the conspirators trusted him. He was disciplined, effective, and ruthless when needed. Asturias had proven what he was capable of. When the coup came in July 1936, Franco would again call on the Army of Africa. This time, not to suppress a region, but to seize an entire nation. When the Popular Front won elections in February 1936, a conspiracy long in gestation hardened. In July 1936, Franco flew from the Canaries to Spanish Morocco to lead the colonial troops across the strait. He sided with the right because, in his own language, only force could save Spain, the nationalists' air bridge, supported by Mussolini's planes and Hitler's Junkers, ferried elite African units to the mainland. From the first days, the White Terror in nationalist zones targeted not only combatants but civilians, trade unionists, Republican officials, and anyone marked as an enemy by local authorities. Scholars disagree on exact totals, but hundreds of thousands died in the Civil War, commonly estimated in the range of 300,000 to 500,000, including both combat deaths and killings in the rear. With nationalist repression systematic from the outset, Guernica's bombing by the German Condor Legion in April 1937 became the emblem of Axis support and of the nationalist way of war. By late 1936, Franco had maneuvered into supreme command. He fused the right's factions into a single party, the Falange Espanola Tradicionalista y de las Chans, and proclaimed himself Caudillo. Victory in 1939 was followed by institutionalized vengeance, military tribunals, martial law, and a tangle of special jurisdictions criminalized support for the Republic retroactively. The law of political responsibilities of February 1939 and the special courts that followed defined dissent as military rebellion against the victorious state. A detailed study of the early post-war years shows how the military justice machine opened around 60,000 cases in 1939 in Madrid province alone. How sentences were initially draconian, and how prisons swelled past 100,000 convicted by military courts by late 1940 even, before adding those still awaiting trial. Martial law remained in force until 1948, and the regime maintained a permanent legal and police architecture to crush its enemies. Civil War terror, 1936 to 1939. The caudillo ascends. By July 1936, Spain was a powder keg. The assassination of conservative politician José Calvo Sotelo by Republican police had electrified the right. Generals plotted a coup. On the 17th to the 18th of July, the army rose in Spanish Morocco, then across the peninsula. The coup did not succeed everywhere. Half of Spain resisted, and the result was not a quick takeover, but a civil war. Franco was in the Canary Islands when the coup began. He flew to Spanish Morocco, where he secured the loyalty of the Army of Africa, his veterans, the Legionnaires and Moroccan Regulars. But they were stranded. The Navy largely sided with the Republic, blocking the Strait of Gibraltar. Franco's solution was bold: an airlift. With German Junkers Ru-52 transport planes and Italian aircraft, 13,000 soldiers were ferried across the strait in the first large-scale military airlift in history. This innovation gave the nationalists their most effective force inside Spain. By late summer 1936, Franco's army was advancing north. By October, his rivals were dead or sidelined. The nationalist junta proclaimed him generalissimo and head of state, caudillo de espada, or la gracia de Dios. The White Terror from the beginning, Franco's war was one of annihilation. Nationalist strategy was not simply to defeat the Republic's army, but to eradicate anti-Spain socialists, anarchists, communists, secular teachers, Freemasons, trade unionists, and anyone sympathetic to the Republic. In Badajoz, after Yag's troops captured the city in August 1936, between 2,000 and 4,000 civilians and prisoners were executed in mass shootings in the Bulleringen streets. In Seville, executions filled cemeteries with unmarked graves. Thousands were killed. In Granada, poet Federico Garcia Lorca was arrested and shot in August 1936, one of thousands of intellectuals eliminated. Executions were systematic. In every captured town, firing squads operated under orders. Civilians were forced to watch, to instill terror. Local landowners and right-wing politicians denounced neighbors. Priests often blessed the killings. By contrast, the Republican zone also saw killings, the Red Terror. Churches were burned, priests and landowners killed, suspected rightists shot by anarchist and socialist militias. Estimates of Republican killings run between 38,000 and 50,000. But unlike the nationalist terror, this violence was decentralized, often curtailed by central authorities. Franco's repression, by contrast, was organized, sustained, and extended beyond the war itself. Guernica and the Axis Franco's alliance with Hitler and Mussolini was crucial. Germany sent the Condor Legion, modern aircraft, and advisors. Italy sent over 70,000 troops, tanks, and planes. Their intervention gave Franco dominance in the air and armor. On the 26th of April 1937, the Condor Legion bombed the Basque town of Guernica. Civilians were strafed as they fled. Incendiaries set the town ablaze. Hundreds died. The exact toll remains debated. Estimates range from 300 to over 1,000. Picasso's painting Guernica immortalized the atrocity. Franco denied it, blaming Reds for burning their own town. But the world knew otherwise. The bombing of civilians was not incidental. It was deliberate terror, a demonstration of modern warfare that the Germans later used in Poland and Russia. Franco welcomed it. Fear broke resistance. Mass graves throughout Spain, the earth filled with the dead. Villages and towns saw nightly executions, corpses dumped in ditches and ravines. Families were forbidden to mourn openly. Graves went unmarked. Historians estimate that 100,000 to 150,000 people were killed by nationalist repression during the war and the first post-war years. The Republican side killed perhaps one-third as many. The imbalance is clear. Franco's policy was extermination of a political class, refugees and exile. As the Republic collapsed, hundreds of thousands fled. In early 1939, nearly 500,000 soldiers and civilians crossed into France in the Retirada, a winter exodus across the Pyrenees. Many ended in French concentration camps. Some were later handed back to Franco, others deported to Nazi camps. For those left in Spain, prison and firing squads awaited. Victory in the Calvilia on the 1st of April 1939, Franco declared, "The war is over." But victory was not reconciliation. It was vengeance. Republican Spain was to be erased. Franco had not only won a civil war, he had remade himself as Spain's absolute ruler, cloaked in divine legitimacy and armed with the ruthless methods he had learned in Morocco and tested in Asturias. The price was half: 1 million dead, a nation in ruins, and a legacy of fear that would linger for generations. Now let's talk about the Blue Division, 1941 to 1944. Franco's gift to Hitler. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Franco saw an opportunity. Spain had stayed officially neutral in World War II, battered and impoverished after its own civil war. But Franco owed Hitler. German aircraft had ferried his troops across the strait in 1936. The Condor Legion had helped him crush the Republic, and German weapons and supplies had sustained his war machine. He could not openly join the Axis. Spain was too weak, and Britain controlled the Mediterranean, but he could send a token of loyalty. That token became the Blue Division, Division Azul, named for the blue shirts of the Phalange. Officially, it was a volunteer force of crusaders against Bolshevism. In reality, Franco's government organized, equipped, and dispatched them under German command. Recruitment and ideology. Recruitment began in July 1941. The call was framed as a holy war against communism. Phalangists, army officers, veterans of the Civil War, and young right-wing students volunteered. Many hoped for adventure. Some hoped to cleanse Spain's honor by fighting alongside the victors of Europe. Others were pressured to volunteer. Sons of Republican families could erase suspicion by joining. In total, around 45,000 to 47,000 Spaniards served in the Blue Division over its existence. They were integrated into the German Wehrmacht as the 250th Infantry Division. They swore loyalty to Hitler personally, though Franco insisted they retain Spanish insignia. To the Eastern Front by autumn 1941, the Blue Division was deployed to the Leningrad Front. They endured the brutal Russian winter, trench warfare, and constant shelling. German officers praised their toughness. Soviet propaganda denounced them as mercenaries of fascism. Conditions were appalling. Frostbite, starvation, lice, and disease killed many. Supplies were poor. The Spanish relied on German rations and clothing, often inadequate for the Russian climate. The Battle of Krasny Borough. Their bloodiest moment came at Krasny Borough, the 16th of February 1943. During the Soviet Operation Polar Star, 44,000 Red Army troops attacked 5,600 Spaniards holding the line near Leningrad. The Spaniards fought desperately. By the end of the day, 3,600 were dead or wounded, nearly two-thirds of the division. German commanders were astonished by their stubborn resistance, but the Blue Division was shattered. Casualties and captivity across its service. The Blue Division lost around 4,950 killed, 8,700 wounded, and 372 captured by the Soviets. Many prisoners were sent to gulags, enduring years of forced labor. In 1954, 9 years after the war, the last 286 survivors were repatriated aboard the ship Semiramis. Their return was celebrated by Franco's regime as a nationalist triumph. Withdrawal and legacy under Allied pressure. Franco recalled the division in late 1943. A smaller remnant, the Blue Legion, stayed until 1944, when Spain finally ordered their return. Some diehards stayed in German service until the fall of Berlin. For Franco, the Blue Division was a balancing act, a way to repay Hitler, indulge Falangist zeal, and keep Spain formally neutral. It was propaganda gold. The regime portrayed the volunteers as heroes who had carried Spain's crusade against Bolshevism to the very gates of Russia. For the men themselves, it was often misery, death, or decades of captivity. For Spain, it was a reminder of how close Franco had tied himself to the Axis, and how narrowly he avoided Spain being dragged into the Second World War. The machinery of repression, 1939 to 1975. Franco's dictatorship began with blood and built its institutions on repression. Unlike Hitler's sudden collapse or Mussolini's downfall, Franco endured nearly 4 decades. The key was a permanent structure of fear-laws and courts since February 1939. The law of political responsibilities criminalized any support for the Republic. Going back to 1934, millions of Spaniards were technically guilty. In practice, hundreds of thousands faced trials. Special tribunals condemned thousands to prison, confiscated property, and destroyed livelihoods. In 1940, the Special Tribunal for the Repression of Freemasonry and Communism was created. Membership in a Masonic lodge or a communist organization was punishable by long prison terms or worse. Franco saw Freemasons everywhere, convinced they were behind a global conspiracy. In 1963, as opposition revived, the regime created the Court of Public Order to handle political crimes. Thousands of workers, students, and activists were tried. Sentences included years of prison, exile, or internal banishment. Prisons and camps. At the war's end, around 270,000 political prisoners filled Spain's jails. By the mid-1940s, perhaps 500,000 people had cycled through prisons and camps, concentration camps, such as Miranda de Ebro, and hundreds of smaller camps held Republicans, soldiers, and civilians. Many were used as labor battalions. The Valley of the Fallen, Franco's monumental basilica outside Madrid, was built between 1940 and 1959, partly by forced labor from prisoners. Estimates vary, but thousands worked there in brutal conditions. The monument was presented as reconciliation. In reality, it enshrined Franco's victory and housed tens of thousands of Civil War dead, many exhumed without family consent. The political police, the Brigada Politico-Social, became the dictatorship's secret police. Its headquarters in Villa Laietana, Barcelona, and in Madrid became synonymous with torture. Dissidents recall electric shocks, beatings, sleep deprivation, mock executions. Fear of informants was constant. Neighbors, colleagues, even family could betray you. Silencing identities. Franco's Spain was unitary and Catholic. Catalan, Basque, and Galician were banned from schools and official life. Newspapers were censored. Books banned. Theater scripts rewritten. Education was entrusted to the Church, which emphasized obedience, Catholic morality, and Spanish unity. Women were legally subordinated to fathers and husbands. Until 1975, married women could not open bank accounts or sign contracts without permission. Homosexuality was criminalized under the Vagrants and Thugs law, amended in 1954, and the Law of Social Danger and Rehabilitation, 1970. Arrest could mean prison, internment, or re-education. Executions and exile executions did not end. In 1939, Through the 1940s and 1950s, anti-Franco guerrillas, the monarchy, were hunted down and shot. In 1944, a guerrilla invasion of the Aran Valley from France was crushed. Survivors executed. In September 1975, just 2 months before Franco's death, 5 militants, 3 from FRAP, 2 from ETA, were executed by firing squad after summary trials. These were the last political executions in Western Europe. Franco's Spain was a prison state, where silence was survival and dissent could mean disappearance. The prison and camp system was vast. Contemporary and recent research estimates that hundreds of thousands passed through Francoist concentration camps and prisons between 1936 and the mid-1940s, with the best documented scholarly ranges running from about 400,000 to well over half a million people processed through camps alone. The camps formed part of a regulated system of classification, forced labor, and re-education, often feeding convict labor battalions that worked on public and private projects. The point was punishment and political neutralization. As much as economic output, the state also sought to collapse civil society. The single party controlled unions and professional associations through vertical syndicates. The press fell under prior censorship by a 1938 press law, and political opposition was driven underground. After the immediate post-war wave of military tribunals ebbed, new instruments took over. The Special Tribunal for the Repression of Freemasonry and Communism policed ideological enemies from 1940. In 1963, after the execution of communist leader Julien Grimau, the regime created the Court of Public Order, staffed by senior judges, to handle most political crimes while reserving death sentences for military courts. No regime source doubts the purpose: to punish anything that subverted the basic principles of the state or disturbed public order, with thousands of cases opened in the 1970s as late Francoism fought to keep the lid on. The work in the shadows fell to the Brigada Politico-Social, the political police, whose headquarters in places such as Via Laietana in Barcelona became synonymous with torture and systematic violations of detainees' rights. A record reconstructed in recent archival-based histories. Repression had an economic dimension. In the 1940s, autarky, rationing, black markets, and official corruption produced the years of hunger. Political prisoners were systematically deployed as labor. The most notorious symbol of this carceral labor state was the Valley of the Fallen at Colgamuros. Conceived by Franco as a monumental tomb and built from 1940 to 1959, there is debate about the precise number of prisoners conscripted for the site. But official documentation confirms 3 penal detachments of political prisoners worked there between 1943 and 1950, and a broad scholarly consensus holds that it was built in part by forced labor. Estimates of how many convicts cycled through forced labor detachments across the project vary from the low thousands to many tens of thousands. The monument also became a mass grave, housing tens of thousands of Civil War dead moved, often without family consent. To sanctify Franco's victory, repression did not end with the 1940s. The anti-Francoist guerrillas, the monarchy, were hunted down through the decade, and when veterans of the French resistance attempted a serious cross-border incursion in the Aran Valley in October 1944, the army smashed it with overwhelming force. A 1947 decree on banditry and terrorism codified the campaign against guerrillas and clandestine opposition. The grinder of justice never stopped entirely. Even as mass parole reduced prison numbers in the early 1940s, special courts and police units kept jailing dissidents and workers' leaders. And military courts still sent opponents to die. By firing squad into the 1960s, Franco's regime was national Catholic. In 1953, he signed a Concordat with the Holy See that reset church-state relations on terms favorable to the dictator, cementing the church's control over education and public morals, while giving the state leverage over ecclesiastical appointments and proclaiming Catholic identity as the core of Spanish nationhood. The same year, Madrid signed the Pax of Madrid with Washington. In exchange for economic and military aid and a path out of post-war diplomatic isolation, Franco granted the United States 4 major bases: air bases at Torrejon, Zaragoza, and Moron, and a naval base at Rota. Framed within broader logistics infrastructure, including a long pipeline across Spain, the Pax made Spain a Cold War partner without erasing the dictatorship's crimes. They did normalize it. In December 1959, Dwight Eisenhower visited Madrid, the first sitting United States president to do so, and was driven through cheering crowds with the Caudillo, a tableau that signaled Spain's full rehabilitation in Western strategy. Franco in the Cold War, 1945 to 1960s. From pariah to ally, when Germany and Italy fell in 1945, Franco's position looked doomed. He had been Hitler's ally in all but name, had sent thousands to fight in Russia, and had traded raw materials with the Reich. Now the Allies viewed him as the last fascist relic in Europe. Post-war isolation Spain was ostracized. In 1946, the United Nations condemned Franco's regime and recommended withdrawal of ambassadors. Spain was excluded from the Marshall Plan. European neighbors closed borders. Economically, the 1940s were the ecos del hambre, the years of hunger. Rationing, black markets, and malnutrition plagued the country. Thousands died of starvation and related diseases. Franco's autarky, economic self-sufficiency, strangled growth. But the regime survived through repression at home and neutrality abroad. Franco played the Cold War card early, insisting that Spain had fought communism before anyone else and was a natural ally of the West, a 1953 Concordat and U.S. Pact. The turning point came in 1953. 2. Agreements changed Spain's fortunes. Concordat with the Vatican, 1953. The Catholic Church recognized Franco's regime. The state regained influence over episcopal appointments, while the Church controlled education and moral life. Catholicism was entrenched as Spain's identity. Madrid agreements with the United States, 1953. Spain granted the U.S. bases at Rota, naval, Torrejon, Zaragoza, and Moron, air. In exchange, Spain received military aid and economic assistance. The U.S. justified the pact on Cold War grounds. Spain was an anti-communist fortress controlling the Western Mediterranean. Rehabilitation in 1955. Spain joined the United Nations. Diplomatic isolation ended. In 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower visited Madrid. Photographs of Ike and Franco smiling together symbolized Spain's return to the Western fold. Franco had transformed fascist pariah to Cold War partner. The West looked away from his repression. Anti-communism mattered more. For Franco, it was vindication. He had endured when Hitler and Mussolini had fallen. The 1959 Stabilization Plan marked a turn from autarky to managed liberalization. The technocrats around Franco scaled back price controls and opened the economy to foreign capital and technology. What followed is commonly called the Spanish miracle. Between about 1960 and 1973, Spain recorded very high growth rates, with real GDP growth averaging in the mid to high single digits and a rapid industrial and urban transformation. Automaking boomed, tourism exploded, highways and housing rose. Living standards improved from the disaster of the 1940s, and a new consumer class appeared, especially in the big cities and on the Mediterranean coast. Yet the model was fragile, entailed stark regional and class inequalities. and relied on low wages, mass immigration, and a political freeze that left workers with few tools to bargain. Franco's foreign policy during the Second World War was a balancing act of ideological sympathy for the Axis and a calculation of risk. Spain stayed formally non-belligerent, but helped the Axis in key ways. The most visible was the Blue Division, an officially volunteer unit raised in 1941 after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. About 18,000 men formed the corps at the beginning, and over the life of the formation, roughly 45,000. Spaniards rotated through the division and its successor, units on the Eastern Front. They fought at the gates of Leningrad and suffered catastrophic losses at Krasny Borough in February 1943, where Spanish casualties ran to several thousand out of some 5,000 defenders engaged. Under Allied pressure, Madrid recalled the division in late 1943, though diehards stayed on as the so-called Blue Legion. Some Spaniards were captured by the Red Army and endured years in labor camps. Most of the survivors trickled back, and some were not repatriated until the mid-1950s. The Blue Division was both a gesture to Hitler and a safety valve that let phalangists and officers fight their anti-communist crusade without entangling Spain in a declared war. The regimes. Social policy combined paternalist welfare with moral control. Women's legal status regressed after 1939. The civil code and administrative practice made married women legally dependent on fathers or husbands for work, property, travel, and even access to bank accounts, with key elements of the marital permission system still in place into the mid-1970s. Sexual minorities were criminalized under the vagrants and thugs law that the regime modified in the 1950s, and then under the 1970 law on social danger and rehabilitation, which explicitly targeted homosexuality with prison or internment. Police used these laws broadly against those they considered deviant. Language and regional cultures were put under pressure. While private use was never eliminated, the state imposed Castilian as the language of schooling and public life and penalized Catalan, Basque, and Galician in official contexts. Censorship and prior authorization governed film, theater, and publishing. The Ministry of Information and Tourism, especially under Manuel Fraga in the 1960s, loosened some controls to court investment in visitors, but kept the architecture oversight. When protests surged, the security state answered. Strikes, student sit-ins, and assemblies were illegal. The political police built files on dissidents and coordinated with French and later Western intelligence services during the Cold War. The Court of Public Order, created in 1963, became a conveyor belt for the regime's definition of political crimes, while the most serious cases still went to military courts. For many Spaniards, there was no confusion about the boundaries. Crossing them could mean beatings and abasement, a decade in prison, or, for militants like Grimao, a dawn firing squad. If we tally the human wreckage, the ledger is stark. In the Civil War itself, the dead number in the hundreds of thousands. In defeat, almost 500,000 refugees fled into France during the retirada of early 1939, a winter exodus of soldiers and civilians that overwhelmed the border and filled French camps. Many returned under duress or false assurances, and many did not. Inside Spain, hundreds of thousands cycled through concentration camps, prisons, and forced labor detachments during the 1936 to 1947 period. Executions continued well into the post-war years, and even when legal mercy widened in the 1940s, militarized justice and special courts preserved the state's power to silence. The regime's own statistics in 1940 reported over 100,000 people already convicted by military courts, with thousands under death sentence, and many tens of thousands still awaiting trial. These figures are not speculative. They are drawn from the regime's internal reports and from the military justice files. Historians have analyzed social control and daily life under Franco's brutal rule. Franco's Spain was not just about prisons and executions. It was about reshaping everyday life to fit a rigid template of Catholic, patriarchal, nationalist values. Women under Franco, women were legally subordinate. The civil code reinstated patriarchal authority. Married women could not work, sign contracts, or open bank accounts without a husband's consent. Divorce was banned. Contraception illegal. The regime promoted the angel of the home ideal, training women in domesticity. The Section Femenina, the women's branch of the Phalange, indoctrinated girls in submission, piety, and motherhood. Language and identity. Catalan, Basque, and Galician were banned in schools, official documents, and public life. Children were punished for speaking them in class. Books and newspapers in regional languages were censored. Only Castilian Spanish was permitted in state functions. Dissent and censorship. Press law of 1938 imposed prior censorship. Every article, play, and film was vetted. Political dissent was banned. Satire, criticism of the church, or questioning the state could bring prison. Writers like Camilo José Cela learned to couch critique in allegory or face bans. The Brigada Politico-Social maintained files on dissidents, infiltrated unions, and tortured prisoners. Arrest at dawn, beatings in police basements, and indefinite detention were common. Fear was constant. Silence was survival. Sexual minorities' homosexuality was criminalized. The Vagrants and Thugs Law, amended in 1954, targeted homosexuals, vagabonds, and antisocial Helens. In 1970, the Law of Social Danger and Rehabilitation replaced it, explicitly criminalizing homosexuality. Gay men were imprisoned or sent to re-education camps. Religion. Spain was a national Catholic state. Religious instruction dominated schools. Church attendance was expected. Public life was infused with Catholic ritual. Secularism was equated with treason. Priests blessed firing squads. Bishops praised Franco as God's instrument. Everyday life for ordinary Spaniards, daily life was defined by silence. You did not speak politics at work, with neighbors, or even with family. Informants were everywhere. People focused on family, church, and survival. The 1940s were marked by hunger. The 1960s by consumer goods. But through it all, politics was forbidden. Spain was modernizing, but mute. The Spanish Miracle, 1959 to 1973. Growth without freedom. By the late 1950s, Franco's regime was facing crisis. Autarky, the economic doctrine of self-sufficiency he had clung to since the Civil War, had produced stagnation, rationing, and black markets. Spain was decades behind Western Europe. Hunger still stalked the countryside. Millions emigrated to France, Germany, and Switzerland for work. And young Spaniards increasingly saw the regime as an obstacle to prosperity. Franco's survival instinct pushed him to adapt. In 1957, he brought in a group of technocrats, many linked to the Catholic lay order Opus Dei, to modernize the economy. They engineered the stabilization plan of 1959. It devalued the peseta, cut subsidies, opened Spain to foreign investment, and embraced orthodox economic measures. The results were dramatic. Between 1960 and 1973, Spain's economy grew at an average of 6 to 7% annually, the fastest in Europe after Japan. Historians call it the Spanish Miracle. Industrialization. Car factories, Seat, Ford, Renault, sprang up. Shipyards expanded. Steel and petrochemical plants modernized. Tourism. In 1960, Spain welcomed 4 million foreign tourists. By 1973, it was 30 million. Sun, beaches, and cheap prices turned the Costa del Sol and Balearic Islands into Europe's playground. Infrastructure, highways, apartment blocks, and airports transformed the landscape. Consumer goods, refrigerators, televisions, and cars entered homes. Middle-class families sent children to university for the first time. Migration and urbanization, the boom reshaped Spain's demographics. Millions left rural villages for Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, and Valencia. Others emigrated to Western Europe, sending remittances home. Rural poverty persisted, but cities expanded with sprawling new districts, filled with concrete apartment blocks. The limits of the miracle but prosperity came with contradictions. Inequality. Wealth clustered in cities and along the Mediterranean coast, while interior regions lagged. Exploitation. Wages remained low, unions illegal. Strikes were banned, but wildcat strikes erupted anyway, often met with arrests. Silence. Political freedoms did not expand. The economic miracle occurred within dictatorship. The censorship office still reviewed every manuscript. Political police still arrested dissidents. The boom brought the regime legitimacy among many Spaniards who equated Franco with stability and rising living standards. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. By the 1970s, the miracle was faltering. Oil shocks, inflation, and worker unrest signaled that Francoism could not last forever. Franco's last years were spent trying to freeze politics while the society he had helped modernize moved on. Strikes grew bolder, clandestine unions organized, and ETA and other armed groups escalated violence. The old man's answer was to tighten screws. In September 1975, less than 2 months before he died, 5 militants were executed by firing squad after rushed trials, igniting international outrage. His own body was failing. In October and November of 1975, he underwent repeated interventions for gastrointestinal bleeding and peritonitis. His abdomen was opened more than once. He was catheterized and connected to machines, and medical bulletins tried to portray control. On the night of the 19th of November, the family finally agreed to disconnect support. The official time of death was given as the early hours of the 20th of November 1975. The date held grim symbolism, echoing the 1936 death of Falangist leader José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the death of Franco, 1975, the long goodbye by the early 1970s. Franco was an old man in his 80s, ill and increasingly isolated. He had already designated Prince Juan Carlos as his successor in 1969, believing the young Bourbon would preserve authoritarian continuity. His loyal lieutenant, Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco, had been assassinated by ETA in 1973 in a spectacular car bombing that hurled his limousine over a convent wall. The regime lost its anchor, and Franco lost his closest ally. Now about his decline, Franco suffered from Parkinson's disease, heart problems, and other ailments. In 1974, he was briefly incapacitated, handing over power temporarily to Juan Carlos. But he returned, stubbornly unwilling to relinquish control. By 1975, his health was failing rapidly. In October, he suffered a series of heart attacks and a perforated ulcer. Doctors performed multiple surgeries. Tubes were inserted. He endured transfusions, dialysis, and catheters. His final weeks became a grotesque public spectacle. Nightly bulletins reported every detail of his decline, as if the state could not admit mortality. Newspapers carried headlines about his pulse, blood pressure, and intestinal bleeding. The final atrocity. Even as Franco lay dying, the regime committed one last crime. On the 27th of September 1975, just weeks before his death, 5 militants, 3 from the leftist FRAP and 2 from ETA, were executed by firing squad after rushed trials. Protests erupted across Europe. Ambassadors were recalled. Spain remained defiant. It was the regime's final show of iron, death, and symbolism. In the early hours of the 20th of November 1975, Franco finally died. Aged 82. The date was deliberate. The regime announced it as the same day that José Antonio Primo de Rivera, founder of the Falange, had been executed in 1936. Franco's life and myth were thus bound to Falangist martyrdom. He was buried at the Valley of the Fallen, the colossal mausoleum he had built with prison labor under the towering cross at the altar. His funeral was attended by kings, presidents, and dictators. Spain entered mourning, official, choreographed mourning enforced by the state. Franco had imagined Spain would continue his authoritarian order under Juan Carlos. Instead, the young king surprised the world by guiding Spain toward democracy. Within 2 years, political parties were legalized. A new constitution was written, and Franco's laws dismantled. But Franco's body remained in the Valley of the Fallen until 2019, when, after fierce political battles, his remains were exhumed and reburied in a family crypt. The act symbolized Spain's ongoing reckoning with its past. The dictator's shadow still looms, unmarked graves, contested memory, and the lingering wounds of silence. Even in death, Franco shaped Spain's landscape. He had placed his tomb at the altar of the Valley of the Fallen, making the basilica a shrine to his power. That changed in 2019, when the Spanish government, after a lengthy legal battle, exhumed his remains and reburied them in the cemetery of Mingarubio in El Pardo. The decision, upheld by Spain's Supreme Court, was justified as a matter of democratic memory. The state would no longer honor a dictator's tomb in a state-built monument constructed with convict labor and filled with the remains of Civil War dead. The transfer, carried out by helicopter in October 2019, was a political and moral statement about the country Franco left behind. What then are the hardest facts about his rule? He won the Civil War with the material aid of Hitler and Mussolini, and by applying in Spain the annihilatory lessons of Morocco. He institutionalized political justice to reclassify half the country as rebels. He built and ran a vast system of camps, prisons, and forced labor. He kept special tribunals and political police in business for decades. He criminalized dissent and difference, from clandestine parties and unions to sexual minorities, and subordinated women's legal personhood to a patriarchal code well into the 1970s. That is the skeleton of a brutal dictatorship. There is also the other side of the record, which his defenders often cite. Under him, Spain avoided the bloodletting of the Second World War and did not become a battlefield. After 1959, his technocrats executed a strategy that, for a time, delivered some of the fastest growth rates in the world, urbanized the country, seeded modern industry, and pulled millions out of the subsistence poverty of the 1940s. He secured a Cold War bargain that brought in capital and security assurances. Catholic social organizations expanded charities and schools, and by the late 1960s, more Spaniards lived longer, ate better, and owned a car or a refrigerator. These gains were real, but they were not costless. They came after a decade of avoidable autarkic disaster, and they were built within a political structure that denied basic rights. Censored ideas and policed bodies. Two images can serve as bookends. The first is Franco in North Africa in the early 1920s. Standing beside the men of the Legion, the tercio's skull insignia on their caps, absorbing a doctrine of fear as an instrument of rule. The second is the helicopter lifting his coffin out of the valley in 2019, watched by a divided crowd. Between those moments lies the life of a man who mastered Spain by breaking it and then reconstructing it in his image, Catholic in identity, military in spirit, unitary in language and law, disciplined in public and punitive toward nonconformity. Understanding his dictatorship requires neither demonization nor apology. It requires simply counting the prisoners and the camps, reading the court files, tracing the laws, walking the quarry faces at Kilgamuros, and measuring the economic arc from autarky to consumer modernity. On those measures, the case that he was a brutal dictator is not a matter of rhetoric. It is a matter of record.